share my project. Just a few slides. So my project is a literary representation of Kaunas Modernism. It is a reimagining of the city through the medium of fiction. My novel, under the title of Snake, is what I like to call a novel in architecture. It's a contemporary novel that revolves around a community of architects. And it is set against a modern, almost utopian city, which is a character in its own right. It is inspired by Kaunas and is based on its modernist architecture. Every nuance of the city depicted in the novel is an expression of the visual and ideological qualities of Kaunas. And it's an integral, organic part of the novel. It's a very personal project for me because Kaunas is my hometown. And since childhood, I've been living in a modernist building with its modernist interior intact. And the house and the whole Kaunas architecture made a great impact on me and continues to do so. This project is a part of my PhD in University of East Anglia in UK, and it is supported by Arts and Humanities Research Council, so it's partly creative, partly scientific. But today I'm going to focus on the creative part, which is the novel. First of all, I'd like to give a little context between the connection between architecture and literature. So despite the difference between their final form, which can at first glance be extreme, architecture and literature are actually very closely interrelated. We can inspire each other and even become one another. And a perfect example of both is the Divine Comedy by Dante. As it happens, the Divine Comedy is inspired by Byzantine Church, and in these pictures you can see Hagia Sophia, which is a typical example of Byzantine Church. So these similarities reside in the numerical relationships, as the square base of the dome of Hagia Sophia measures 100 Byzantine feet, and there are 100 candles in the Divine Comedy. Also in Hagia Sophia, the Christ Interpreter is in the heavenly sphere of the cupola on top, while the saints are in the lowest, and the similar spatial scheme is presented in the Divine Comedy through successive axes along of descent or ascent. Then there is an architectural representation of the Divine Comedy itself. Dantium, that you can see in the pictures, is architectural allegory of the Divine Comedy. It was designed by Giuseppe Terrani, and it is a sequence of monumental spaces that show the narrator's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. It was never actually implemented, but was presented at the 1942 exhibition in Rome. Dantium also works as an example of translation, because Dante himself was inspired by architecture. The connection between space and text doesn't end there. Narratives can be used to express various literary functions. For example, architectural objects can be used by writers to reflect essential ideas of their works. They perform a wide range of functions, from revealing the inner life of characters, serving as models to structure society, to providing an ideology. Representation of urban spaces in literature are countless, from Homer's Odyssey to The Great Gatsby and more contemporary literature. Kaunas lends itself very favorably to creative fiction. It's a very rich source of inspiration. The exceptional modernist architecture, its remarkable status, its history and culture make it for a very favorable material to take into the literary plane. The style of Kaunas modernism also inspires the style of writing. clean, purposeful, functional design dictates the way the story is written. Laconic, simplistic, minimalist, concentrating on main plot points without unnecessary details. Modernist architecture also helps reveal the most important themes. It's not just the setting of the novel, but a technique revealing the characters and exploring, presenting, and strengthening its motifs. So I'll give a couple of examples of how architecture functions in the novel and how Kaunas is brought to life by text. The first and very important element is the history and ideology of optimism. The consistent style of Kaunas came to life as the city had to be developed very quickly and for the growing needs. It became the temporary capital, and its status and therefore identity changed overnight. It is truly exceptional how rapidly Kaunas managed to accomplish a new and original character. In Snake, the novel, a whole chapter is dedicated to the history of Kaunas and how it came to be what it is. Those important decisions that determined the idiosyncratic character and unique aesthetic. All the while, a modern philosophy stood behind these decisions. The goal was to create a city that's contemporary as well as well-constructed and durable. In step with the dynamic modern world and also containing the characterful expression of national identity. It's an extremely rare case for a city to be planned like this, in such a consistent way. Usually, cities grow in a long run, and according to growing needs, and their development can be quite unpredictable. One style changes the other, and what we end up is a mixture of various styles. In Kaunas' case, there is no mixture that got together for the course of history. There is this consistency of modernism, but the city was built during an unbroken surge. When minds of everyone, not just architects, were directed in one direction and one philosophy. And so the very consistent modernism of Kaunas architecture is an expression of a consistent philosophy, that of growth, faith, and revival. Or in one word, of optimism. This is what the conceptual and solid buildings radiate in their every line and turn, and every choice of design. And here is the extract from the novel that describes the history of the city. It was through a distinct course of history that the city came to be what it was. Most of the city as it was built on the philosophy of optimism. An exceptional political situation determined that it became quite unexpectedly the capital. It meant that all the administrative and governmental organs had to be moved to it, along with the search of new residents. But it also meant it had a chance to become something entirely else than it had ever been before. It was a fresh start, a clean slate, a chance to make something new, and it could be anything. The country had just freed itself from years of oppression, and the slums were now full of liberty and action and decision. It was like a world at the simmering state of creation, and everything was filled with boundless possibility. No expense was ever spared. The demand for the new buildings was tremendous. At the same time, it was commercial as much as it was visionary, led by idealism and the strong belief and inspiration to do something new and unravel. It was the time that would be later known as the period of optimism. What defined the artists of the time was their combative and determined attitude, their maximalism. If they were asked to build a civilization in the middle of the desert, a language, a religion, and a social system, they would have done just that. No task was too great or too small. But architecture was what gave tone to everything, and what determined the way of life of everyone else. New buildings provided a setting for a new world, and in the broadest sense, it was in the world. Architects seemed to be materializing out of nowhere, returning from foreign universities and studios built to the brim with ideas to be executed in their city. And people seemed to be waiting on the threshold of each object to spill in and bring them to life. The need of the buildings coincided with a great architectural achievement in them. It was exhilarating, Every time, it was as though the audience and the critics were only waiting for a writer to finish his poem to shower it with acclaim. The demand was so high that competition acquired a form never seen before. It all went into uniting universal inspiration and nothing else. Architects had absolute and universal freedom. They used to create pure functional forms according to the latest trends. A small old town was quickly surrounded by modernism. Apartment buildings, private houses, public buildings, and open spaces emerged one after the other. Restaurants opened up with their compactly elaborate interiors, marvelous food, orchestras, and lounges. Rows of stairs with tree-framed terraces descended from greenfield, fountains which gushed out. But the minimalist, clean modernism was rich, solid, and firm. Opulence and richness seemed to be flowing from it. It was decorated in the complexity of its construction. The excess was done, and probably, in a way, an understatement. The design of the city was as inspired as it was methodical. From the very start, it was being designed as a garden city. Urban space was inventively filled with nature. Main streets were dotted with lindens and chestnut trees. Parks etched into precise symmetrical spaces. The same trees in giant, slanted down over with white pavements and frilly squares. One of the optimists once said that it was a city impossible to get lost in. It was so geometrical, as though it was lined with a ruler, and the main reason for it was that it always followed one concept, one logic, and was always planned in advance. Each decision, however inspired, was weighed and affirmed before it was implemented. Every building corresponded to the philosophy. Each was light, modern, practical, and solid. Each design flowed seamlessly from function. Each offered something of their own, be it a wholly remarkable facade, a novel construction, a staircase, or a window patterning, and everything the most modern, new, fashionable, always of the highest rank and quality, and then with a zest and consideration that made it unique. Another important way of depicting Kaunas modernism in the novel is the interiors of its legendary restaurants. Kaunas had a remarkable culture of restaurants during the interwar and later. Sadly, most of them are no longer functioning, and even the interiors are lost. But still, we prevail in people's memories. We carry a strong atmosphere and energy as though we still existed, and the market we left is very clear. The novel offers an alternative reality where these restaurants still exist, taking an important, remarkable place in the city. And it is also a way of recreating these modernist interiors and their character through the text. This is the extract from the novel that describes the character through the interior of one of the restaurants. Moments later, we invaded the solid elegance of Tulip's green and white ballroom. By far the leading place in the city, the richest in history, Tulip combined awe-inspiring opulence with a completely understated quality. There was something almost incredibly comforting about it. Its 4 dining rooms, each with its own name and reputation, were set around a large ballroom, switching swiftly into the bar. Each was lit and dimly bright, the transition from theater to outside. Yet it was overwhelmingly independent. It carried its own rules and state of mind, drawing its visitors quite imperceptibly. Orbit or Kelpie made you feel as though you had been patently wrapped into decoration. Here, the air was wavering in a distinct way, and you were altered, according to its tone, the minute you stepped inside. The tone that it dictated was impossible to resist. The spaces were arranged with correct, simple precision that contained all the decoration, every elaborate turn, every ornament, rows of columns, and arched ceiling, without showing it off. As a result, the decoration of the restaurant had become restrained. It was put into very exact architectural bounds. It was as though those strict symmetrical lines had affected the very air between them, assembling it in these definite spaces and making it rich and dignified. to read on. Light and shadows made a strange symmetry in the dining room. The light went in through the high-set windows, making the room rather dark, but every table was lit by a round lamp and inspired by thin white lamps. The unique design of the city, its character, and its consistency can help but affect those living there. The city is more than a setting for characters, and more than a place where we live, meet and experience. It's a part of their identity too. Naturally, their own personalities shift as we adapt. The nature and the city that's largely determined by its smallest and most carefully considered design. It becomes a part of the way of their scenes work, their approach to it, and an inciting element of their lifestyle. The city is an extension of the characters and their feelings, or rather, we are an extension of the city. There is also significance in the fact that the protagonist sees the city in two planes, the actual buildings around him and their place in a bigger picture, or a mental map that he carries with him. This accentuates the philosophy behind Kaunas Modernism, a greater concept behind its every detail, and its every physical manifestation being an expression of that concept. And the following is the corresponding extract from the novel. The city was glistening faintly in the dusk when Anthony was walking back by late in the afternoon. The impression that it gave was that of broken consistency. In this light, separate facades seemed like a homogeneous mass of opaque hematite. It was as though every separate apartment was an individual expression of the same thing. They extended continuously forward. Each line was precise, each was purposeful. All of them were leading somewhere. The terraces of Green Hill descended in a series of stairs onto the streets that crossed each other with geometrical precision, like they were drawn along a ruler, with their modest exteriors concealing restaurants, steaming bars, white, black, and green marble, their white pavements framed by even rows of windows, flowing incessantly onto the riverside with its plastic bends, and even further on to the wild island stretching out into the distance of the river, coated with pale mist hanging above the water. There was something remarkable in the fact that he could orient himself in the city, seeing it both as a methodical structure, a map, and as an obvious, accessible expression. Every building, line, and turn, the way they took their place in a bigger picture, and a layout that reflected each of their positions. He was walking at the same pace as other people around him, not faster, not slower. No one appeared to be hurrying. Everyone's motion was drawn in the very nature of the reserved, still city. It dictated their behavior. You wondered what it would change if you were to increase his pace, to intrude harshly on the gently moving pole, seeking to destroy it. He was inseparable from the city. He was now entirely immersed in its rhythm. This would happen, as he thought, only when he would accept it unconditionally, with all that it was, and tune in the tone that it set down, that was stronger than him, than anything else, existing independently and mystifyingly. It was the only way to get to know the city, to give meaning to it, or rather be absorbed by it, moving through these motionless spaces. In moments like this, he felt like the city needed him as much as he needed it. He felt a part of an incessant, purposeful mechanism. He, the resident of the city, was necessary for it to fulfill its function. These moments made him feel more fond of the city than anything else he knew. He'd only feel he knew it better than anyone. It seemed like he couldn't exist anywhere else. And so, by describing these architectural spaces, it is possible to reveal the important themes that the novel carries. The extraordinary character of Kaunas Modernism affects the course of storytelling and becomes an integral part of the narrative. The novel gives meaning to the architecture of this part as well. It is ultimately an interdisciplinary approach that enhances all planes of artistic expression. Architecture, Kaunas Modernism in this case, inspires literary expression, which then in turn evokes emotions and makes us look at and describe urban spaces in a different way. It is a way to explore the unique qualities of Kaunas Modernism offering a means of preserving and revealing many angles of Kaunas' concept, history, philosophy, the aesthetic of its design, and the ultimate originality of its concept. Thank you very much for your attention.